she's been doing highly interesting research on trying to make connections between domestic violence as an individual occurrence, a psychological occurrence, and making connections and connecting the dots to some of the larger social structures like poverty, globalization, etc., economic policies. So she's going to present a variety of her research today. I was asked to introduce Shaanta because I've also been doing research in Pakistan on some similar issues, and we've been comparing notes, and it's very interesting that the countries, they were one country at one point. They share a number of cultural and contextual factors in common, but Bangladesh has naturally gone somewhat in a different direction. We've been comparing notes on that. So I can attest, though, from the research that it's challenging. As I mentioned in the introduction, domestic violence is still a very taboo subject. There's increasing violence, political violence taking place in Bangladesh as so in Pakistan. So it does present challenges for researchers. So this research that she's presenting is very valuable and hard. It takes a lot of determination to gather the data. So I think we're very privileged to be able to hear from Shaanta's research. So I'm going to turn it over to Shaanta. I'm hoping that someday we will be able to come back and perhaps present some comparative things between Bangladesh and Pakistan, because I think that makes for an interesting discussion.
I look forward to that. Also, as Philomena kindly said, I'll be talking about conducting research in Bangladesh, but I'll also talk about some of the things that I've realized as I've come to conduct research in that region. So I'll start with this picture. This is a picture of people going to work. Just take a second to look at the picture. I'll talk about it at the end of my presentation, the end, with more notes. And so what I'll talk about is conducting the research on violence and related issues. That's what I do. A lot of my research has been on intimate partner violence or domestic violence. But I've also looked at things like contraceptive use and decision-making surrounding use of contraceptives and so on. So women's health issues in particular. And so Bangladesh is a country where political violence is huge, it's omnipresent, and intimate partner violence remains a taboo despite its high prevalence. And that seems contradictory, because if it's so prevalent, why is it still a taboo? But that's one of the things that make me do this kind of research. And also in Bangladesh, we've seen that women's groups have proliferated over the last couple of decades. So NGOs or non-government organizations, as well as institutions such as microfinance, have made a place for women in Bangladesh. But again, women's status remains low, and because it does, it makes research in this area interesting, because you would imagine that with such interventions that women's status would increase. But why does it not? And that remains a question. Some numbers. So worldwide, UN Women says that there is 70% of women experience intimate partner violence and or sexual violence by an intimate partner, and 35% by non-partners, which goes to show that intimate partner violence is far more pervasive than non-partner violence in the world. In the United States, these numbers are old but highly important. So 1 in 4 women experience violence by an intimate partner. And in Bangladesh, that's about 30%. So 30% report to being in a violent relationship in Bangladesh. Political violence numbers are pretty high too. So between 2015 and 2016, about 12,000 people were killed or injured. And the sources of such violence are inter-party or intra-party clashes, and by party I mean political party. And this remains really high, and AL is Awami League, BNP is Bangladesh Nationalist Party, and others. So if you quickly take a look at the numbers, those are really high for a nation which is a democracy, for a nation which is home to elections and so on. But a note about numbers, and this is true for domestic violence or intimate partner violence, as well as political violence. That violence of all types is often underrepresented by such numbers. And that's because measurement tools such as conflict-tested scale measure specific acts, such as pushing or hitting, as does counting events, like the political violence is counted as either people being injured or being killed. But it doesn't account for the fear and intimidation that women may feel at home or people may feel on the streets. So everyday violence is extremely, extremely high. And it ignores the climate of violence, it ignores the unquantifiable forms of oppression and the spaces and locations of violence, as well as the range and complexities of it. A quick story. So I'm in Bangladesh, I am sitting in a car, I have somebody driving for me because I can't navigate those roads by myself. It's nearly impossible. Well, I could, but then I wouldn't probably live. And so I'm sitting there, and all of a sudden there's some kind of ruckus going on, and I think, what's going on? And there's a bus, the bus driver gets down, another driver from another car gets down, and they're punching each other. And I'm just like, oh my god, what's going on? And the person who's driving my car is sitting there, completely complacent, it's the most natural thing in the world. And what that really speaks to is the normalization of violence, that something like that is so prevalent that even, and I know this, and even then I'm shocked, but I don't live there every day. And so when I see it every time I go back, it's still somewhat shocking, but it isn't for those who live there. And I think that speaks to, in my head, how pervasive the violence is, how normalized it is, and how this is true in all spheres, and it's true in all locations, either at home, on the streets, at the workplace, and so there is that thread that ties all kinds of violence in my head. And it makes me realize that the narrative on violence against women is the narrative of sameness, where when we talk about violence, we often talk about how violence is experienced similarly across domains. But it marginalizes, in my opinion, those who don't fit that norm. And it overlooks and suppresses public, institutional, and structural violence. And so to think about it, I think it's important to think about violence at home and home as an institution, in which social actors are husbands or wives or partners. And safety is the key tenet of the home. And the woman is the producer of home, and violence is the failure to provide that safety. And that's her failure. And I use Joshua Price's explanation to make sense of that. So he says, the home is frequently a place of terror, violence, and danger. And looking at home in terms of safety and danger, there are a couple of things we need to think about. So the description of home as a place of safety works towards making violence against women in the home difficult to perceive or see. The assumption that a home is not safe not only obscures violence, it obscures the labor that produces the home. And the home is imagined as safe, often when it is not. The home is constructed and then ideologically maintained as given. And the home is also the location of emotional and other forms of investment. Building a successful home is connected to a sense of self, to a sense of accomplishment in life. And when we make that happen, like the whole idea of home ownership, for example, and how that's the ideal way to live. All of those things contribute to these things. And the social actors are so then invested in building that home and occupying it and providing for it and having dominion over it. So if a woman desires the safety of home and accepts her role as producer of it, then being abused is conceptualized as failure. And not, like I said, not just his, but hers. And so this normative ideal of safety abets and enables violence against women. As such, violence against women and domestic violence are often seen as synonymous. And we see that in policy. VAWA, for example, when they talk about violence against women, we often think of it as a domestic violence law. And we do that, and in doing so, we're overlooking and suppressing the structural violence that women often experience. And the narrative also looks at violence as a binary, where there's a victim and there's a perpetrator. There's this idea of good and bad. And what that does, again, via laws or via intervention by police, it gives state power over women. It allows them to control women's bodies. Men's too, but women's more. And I think it becomes important to realize that violence is not class and race neutral. And the system engenders much of the violence that women experience. And gender and class oppression via patriarchy and neoliberalism creates violent spaces for women. And then there are other forms of discrimination. And we see this in this country, we see this in Bangladesh. Discrimination such as housing discrimination or employment discrimination, where women don't have equal opportunity for jobs, or they don't have equal opportunity for finding housing for themselves. like single women find it extremely it's extremely difficult for single women to find housing in Bangladesh. So although so the home is not the only institution that produces violence. There are other institutions like the workplace, like law enforcement, like schools, public transport, and the justice system. And one thing we need to realize is that there are running themes of like inequity and inequality and disparity that come from patriarchy and neoliberalism. And there are certain groups that are more likely to experience such violence. And in doing so, we need to think about intersectionality. So in other words, violence takes place both in private and public locations. Inequality and inequity makes violence inevitable, and violence is disproportionately experienced by certain groups. And structural violence normalizes interpersonal violence while allowing violence against women to continue at home, and patriarchy allows the maintenance of that violence in all such places. And here are some examples. I'll start with this picture. This picture is from a small store, actually a Bikash store. You usually would know what that is. So I was doing interviews on mobile money, and I went to a store, and this poster is on the wall. And this has nothing to do with Bikash Binju. This says Juna Okamata, which means sexual dysfunction. And then it says Bonoraj Herbal Center. So it's named for a herbal center. And in a country where people rarely talk about sex, it's a little mind-boggling to see a sign like that. So this is a public space where women and children and everybody has access to, and they go in there and they see this, and I wonder if sex is introduced to children as a dysfunction, what does that do to them? And so I start with that because there are such examples. This is an example that I think we don't often talk about, but there are other examples that are like that we see on media, such as female feticide in Northwest Delhi. That happens at home. And then Rumana Manzoor beaten and blinded by her husband. She was a student in Canada, and this happened a couple years ago. And then schoolgirl Kain's family is too poor to buy a uniform for her. And then in Dhaka, a teacher is sentenced to life in prison for raping a 5-year-old student. The Delhi gang rape is probably well known, but this happens also in Bangladesh. Here's a story of a 22-year-old woman being gang raped. And places of worship in India, police arrest 4 men over rape of a nun. And then, of course, we know about state actors such as the police playing a role in victimizing women. And then there's history, and by history, I speak to history in South Asia, where we've had this history of partition. So India used to be one whole nation, and that got divided into India and Pakistan, and then Pakistan got divided into Pakistan and Bangladesh. And those were very bloody partitions, and that involved rape as a weapon of war. And that entailed a lot of forced abortions. We still have a lot of children, because this history isn't that long, and it's in 1971 that Bangladesh became independent. And so there are still people who live in Bangladesh who are products of such rapes. And there are women who live today, and there's a name for them. There was a name that was given to them, Virangana, which was supposed to make them feel better. It was like terming them fighters or warriors. But everybody knew what that meant, because that meant they were victims of rape. And given, again, the taboo of sex and the taboo of sexual intercourse, it became problematic to be identified as somebody who was a virangana. And when you become that meant, they found it difficult to get married, they found it difficult to find a position for themselves at work or anywhere else, and they basically remained at home. So there are 1 or 2 people who have gone on to become something else. Like there's an artist who's very popular, but people know her as a virangana, but she found it, she's one of the few who found it found a name for herself in society, and who took that identity and made it her own. But that's very rare. And also, we need to think about intersectionality all over again. She was educated. She came from a family that had education, so that protected her. Those who were not as protected. And so we have a lot of unresolved trauma from those wars and in the post-partition period. And then we have religion that makes it, religion takes upon itself the idea of controlling women's bodies via telling women what to wear, what not to wear, when to veil, when not to veil. And all of that creates a system of subjugation that we continue to see today. And so 45 years after independence, Bangladesh sees that violence is the only viable means of protest. So we see burning buses all the time. We see acts like those punching people on the streets all the time. And it's the most widely used method of state control and oppression. And it makes you think that when there's violence everywhere, it really is everywhere. And when I say that there's a co-option of democratic tools by organizations, I mean, protest is a human right. Being able to protest is a right that people have in Bangladesh that's somewhat been guaranteed by the democratic process. However, when people take that power and use it to burn buses as a means of protest, it's no longer a protest. It's more terroristic in nature. And I think that in the name of democracy, burning a bus with people in it is completely undemocratic. But that's the kind of violence that we see, and it's legitimized because it is a democratic right. And so that convoluted idea of democracy then engenders violence. And so why is this important? Other than violence is an important issue in itself, it's also important to know that violence makes women lose control over their bodies, and that increases their odds of a host of things, including unwanted pregnancy, unsafe abortions, HIV, mental health outcomes, physical outcomes, and so on. Women experiencing violence are more than twice as likely to have an abortion, for example. And those things also need to be taken into account. So violence, not just for the sake of violence, but it also has ramifications for women's health and health of those who experience violence. And so structural violence disproportionately affects particular groups. Again, women who are poor, for example, are more likely to be in locations of violence, and so health outcomes are also disproportionately distributed. So in my research, I've tried to provide an understanding of violence and how that relates to women's issues and so on. And I've used structural interventions as a starting point, because you would think that when women have access to certain tools, their lives would be better. And I've also started recently to look at mobile money and banking services, which is a way to foster inclusive financial services. My research is mostly mixed methods. I use data from Bangladesh Demographic and Health Surveys. So the DHS has surveys on many developing countries, so I use the one for Bangladesh. I've used for other countries too, but that's primarily what I work with. I've also done in-depth interviews with men and women in slum areas. And my research is mostly in the context of poverty and poverty interventions. So very quickly, I'll go over some of the research that I've done. I've found that childhood exposure to violence significantly associated with IPV perpetration as adults. So the idea that violence is a method of conflict resolution becomes apparent, and that's apparent also on the street. Like the bus driver and the car driver who came and started punching without any words. I think that's similar in effect, because that's how they were resolving their conflict of overtaking. But it's similar in the house as well, at home. I've also found in the paper with Dr. Ely, women who experienced IPV were more likely to access and use contraceptives compared to women who did not. And that's interesting too. So women who experience violence are taking it upon themselves to do things to protect themselves. So there is some glimmer of hope there. I've also found that experiencing economic abuse significantly lowered economic self-sufficiency of women, and this is with people with some other colleagues from Rutgers. And I found that microfinance participants with health assets were more likely to report IPV. And I found that men married to microfinance participants were less likely to make sole decisions regarding contraceptives. which means that they were more likely to make joint decision making. So there is that glimmer of hope as well. Also, microfinance participants were 30% more likely to be HIV literate. And microfinance participants were not statistically different from a matched group of non-participant empowerment. But empowerment is a big construct, and maybe we can talk about it more in the discussion. And so conducting research in Bangladesh, how does that work? I think one of the most important things that I need to realize for myself as I kind of research in that area is privilege and power and position. Like, who am I and why am I there? And am I falsely giving the impression that I am there to help when I'm not, because I am a researcher? I am because my research has been on microfinance. I've gone to ask about that, and people have asked me if I am there with money, if I am going to be giving them microfinance. And then I have to tell them that no, I'm not giving them money, and then it's like, then why am I going to talk to you? And so navigating that and explaining that I am here to understand and but not speak for themselves, for them. And so that's the other thing. I have to make sure that I am not speaking for them. I am speaking about what I am seeing of them. And there is a big difference between the two. And of course, there is always a need for a safety plan. My interviews take me to certain locations that are unsafe for women. Women who live there, of course, but also women who go there. And there's a whole political economy of slums in Bangladesh where you have their gatekeepers. They'll let you in. They'll ask you why you're there and what you need. And so I've used school teachers from slum areas to introduce me to people who then let me in and who then trust me because they trust the school teacher because they're part of the system. And I think it's always also important for me to realize that I will always be the outsider. And so no matter what I'm wearing and no matter what I'm doing, and I am from there, but I'm still an outsider. And that's something that I think came to me late, because I used to think that, well, I'm from there, it's fine. But it's not. I may be from there, but I still am an outsider. And I need to view them as that. I need to, again, like I said, I cannot speak for them. I can speak about them. And I'll have to make sure that I am able to make that distinction. And then there's the issue of paying subjects. So a lot of people in Bangladesh say that they don't pay subjects because when they subjects, and by subjects, they're human subjects. And so the idea is that if you pay people for the interviews, then you will get any number of people to come and talk to you to tell you what you need to hear. And that's a function of poverty. And so how do we navigate that? At the same time, they're having to give up their time and labor to come talk to me. So how do we make sense of that? So that has always been a question for me. So what I did was I would give them some money at the end of the interview, not before. I would not announce that and tell them, here's some money for tea. But I couldn't announce that that's what I was going to do. And that's a problem with IRB here too. Like, so what are you going to do? Are you not going to pay them? And but I am, but just not in the way that we are supposed to. And so that's an issue. And that's probably true in all international settings. And then the idea of connecting with people that I'm talking to. So some people, they tell you their life stories. They're crying. There's some report, and you connect with them. But then you still have to be objective, and you still have to sort of pull back and speak of them and make sense of their experiences and not get embroiled in it, because it's so easy for you to be like, well, I think this is what you should do, and it's hard to in certain situations to pull back and sort of remain objective. Also because they're engaging in a dialogue. They think you're engaging in a dialogue. And when you're not really, because when I'm a researcher, I am not really engaging in a dialogue. I'm trying to understand. It becomes problematic because then they ask you for advice, they ask you about your life, and you don't want to talk about your life. So then what does that exchange mean for them, and what does it mean for me? And how does that impact my research? Does that make me less objective? And again, like I said, that's something that I need to be careful of. And of course, why are you here? If you're here to talk to me, then why are you not talking to me? So that's something again that I need to keep thinking about. And then, are they telling me what I am wanting to hear? Are they telling me what they think they should be telling me? And that's perhaps true in social work practice as well as research. And there's no real way to know that. There are interviewing techniques of asking the same questions in different ways over and over again. But that remains an issue. If they're consistent, then sure. But then, are they always consistent? The idea that they're always aware of themselves is wrong too. To assume that they know what it is that they're experiencing and what it is that they're thinking about it is a big question. It's expecting them to be self-aware when they don't have the tools to be that. And then there's the urban and rural divide. And I think that was the most interesting to me. There. So that's me in rural Bangladesh. I was conducting interviews. And what became clear was that in rural Bangladesh, I will never have space where I can talk to them one-on-one. So it's almost like a theater. I am sitting there, and you can't see, but there's a line of women standing there. There's this man walking behind me, whom I didn't know at the time, but there he is. There's a child standing right in front of them, and I'm supposed to have these conversations with them in that setting. And so, first of all, there are multiple issues with that. One, I'm not being able to ensure privacy, so there are questions that I cannot ask. And even when I am asking them about things that are perhaps broad, I don't know who they are speaking to. Are they speaking to me? Are they speaking to each other? Are they speaking to the people around us? Is this their way of communicating to the larger community? And that's interesting in itself, but it is a challenge. I wanted to go inside and have a conversation indoors, but I wasn't allowed. And there were another interesting thing that happened was there was another person who was supposed to come join us, because then this had to be a focus group interview. I couldn't do one-on-one interviews. And so in a house, so these are all little huts, and they're their houses. That's where they live. And in a hut right next to that, there was a woman who was standing inside, and I could see she was standing there, and she's supposed to come out. And I was like, "Aren't you gonna come?" And she goes, "I'm waiting for my mother-in-law to give me permission." And the mother-in-law never came because she was at another house, and so she never came and joined the conversation. And the husbands were all in the city. So this is rural Bangladesh. Husbands are not there. They're in the city working. They're migrant workers. And here they are living in a system with mother-in-laws, and they now take control of their lives. And that was rural Bangladesh for me. And again, very interesting in terms of finding privacy, finding a space to talk to. Another mother-in-law story, if you have time for that. So in one house I was allowed in. I go there, and I'm talking to the woman in the house, and she says her husband is a banker, and they make good money. She wants to have more. At first she says she wants to have more children, but she already has 2. So I asked about that, and she goes, "No, it's actually my husband who wants that." Okay, and then I said, "So what do you do at home, when you're not, doing housework?" And she says, "I read books sometimes." I said, "Okay." And then I asked something about what she does again, and she goes, "There's no time for work. I don't do anything other than work. That's all I do. My life involves taking care of the kids, and that's it." And then I looked around and I saw her mother-in-law, this woman standing there, and then I realized that her narrative changed because somebody came and stood there. And so so I asked, "Who is that?" She's like, "Oh, my mother-in-law." And then I realized that, okay, so her narrative of what she does in her free time changes based on who's watching and who's speaking to you. And so again, extremely difficult to really understand what's going on in situations like that. And that's something that we have to deal with. And which is why a space like this is so great, because I can talk about this, because there's no journal article that I can write about this, but I think it's important to note that while we do this kind of research in international settings, it's often the questions that are not asked that becomes important, even though there's no space to really write about it. And so that's me. I'm going back from doing some of the interviews. I'm wearing my bag on top of me so that my body shape is not very clear, and I have a headscarf around me. And that's, again, similar to the picture you see in the beginning where lots of people have headscarves around them. And when you look at that, you might think that, here's a Muslim majority country, people, cover up. But it really isn't about that. It wasn't for me. It was really more about safety and avoiding male gaze. And my sense is that it is that for others too. Like those people who are walking to work at 6 in the morning in the first picture, it's the same thing. Women are now out there, they work, they're part of the labor market, but the system remains problematic for women. The system remains unsafe for women. And so they found a way to conquer the streets, if you will, by covering themselves up. But the problem remains, and women remain subjugated in both at home and on the streets. And which is why our work must go on. Thank you.
Any time for questions, discussion?
My question is, the reference you made to I was not allowed to go north to do research, could you
Go
explain?
to somebody's house. So
Okay, thanks.
So people wouldn't let me into their house. I'm an outsider, so outsiders stay out. So that space that you saw for the city, so that's really for people to come and sit. So they have benches and so on, and that's shared space. Everybody from that locality come and sit there, but nobody's allowed inside.
Just had a question. Like you mentioned empowerment. I wondered if you could just expand upon that a little bit and how you were kind of forming that as a concept in your work.
Right. So in the demographic and health surveys, they talk about empowerment in terms of household decision-making power, justification of intimate partner violence, and having autonomy to go to seek health services. And so it's constrained in that manner, and so that I feel that definition often becomes problematic. So it ignores the structural factors. So which is why I said it's complicated.
You mentioned the 47 partition and the 71 genocide, as I think we should call it. Was there any repercussion at all from the Rohingya and their treatment in Myanmar in the communities that you looked at?
Well, that's a complicated question, but the repercussions may not be associated with either the partition or the genocide, but more in terms of borders, like so new borders. And the prevailing idea is that Rohingyas are Bangladeshis, but only in Burma. In Bangladesh, the idea is that no, they're not Bangladeshis, they're Burmese. And even though there has been pressure to take on Rohingyas into Bangladesh and by the UN and so on, Bangladesh doesn't have the resources to provide for them. So they have it, and so they've become boat people. They're in boats, in between the territories. And in Bangladesh, the prevailing narrative is that they're terrorists. So when people are arrested, they said, somebody from Burma was arrested. It's a Rohingya terrorist. And I think that narrative is prevalent because it assists the idea that we're not going to take them in, and so obviously very problematic. But that's what it is. Zoe and then.
So for safety reasons, are you always or usually with someone else?
Yes. I have a female research assistant who goes with me. She's a little older.
Would it be safer, would it be safer if that was a man, or are you more welcomed in by women because you're two women?
Yes. Well, a lot of my interviews are with women, and so those I would not be able to do with men. Yeah, when I've interviewed men, they don't go well, so I usually hire a male research assistant who does that on their own. I don't even go in.
Why does it?
Well, they don't want to tell you. They don't want to tell you if I'm asking about violence. I'm asking about their relationships. It's personal. They're not going to tell me. And they do, but they tell me how it is and how everything's fine. And so then so it doesn't go well for me. It goes well for them.
I know. Thank you.
you ever able to interview any of the women in a place separate from that kind of amphitheater? Like, do women, work? Are they in the labor force at all? Were you ever able to speak to a woman kind of one-on-one in that sort of situation?
I've spoken to women in urban Bangladesh. So in Dhaka, which is the capital, when I do interviews there, I often have them come to the school. So the school teacher who introduces me to them, they provide a space for me to talk to women and to do the interview. So that's when I have a one time with them. So I can do that in urban Bangladesh. They do have a certain degree of freedom that they can come and meet with me. But in rural Bangladesh, that's very difficult. Kelly.
I find the role of the mother-in-laws pretty interesting. So what role do you see that they have in perpetuating this violence or keeping silent? What role do they play?
Huge. They also partake in the violence.
Right.
And they do. But to an extent, they're also protective too. So if it gets too much, so I think what they do is they keep it at a happy.
Happy for whom?
Happy for them because then she doesn't leave. You know, so if it's at a medium level where it's not super high, because if it's extreme violence, then women almost always leave. And so for them to remain in the household, and because when they're in the household, they're also part of the labor that goes into the household, and so they don't want to lose that either, particularly in rural settings. And so that becomes, so they want the person to remain, and for them to be able to do that, it can be too bad for them. And so it's both.
That's,
I have a follow-up to that, because I wanted to ask things similar, but I was also wondering if the mothers-in-law sort of are occupying more of sort of a merged perpetrator and victim role. Is that how?
So women's status is associated with age, for example, and bearer of male children. And so once you have male children and then they get married and they have wives, they also are they're part of they're almost like the husband, you know, in the roles that they play. And so in the absence of the husband, they become that person who will then control the women. And sure, they've had that violence in their lives too, perhaps, but it's the system. It's how it is. And you would think that it would help them think that, well, I've gone through this and I don't want this to perpetuate even further, but it does. Did you have something?
Well, just because this is a very common issue in Pakistan, and sometimes the mother-in-laws were really some of the main perpetrators. And actually, people who started domestic violence programs here in New Jersey had to take some South Asian women started their own shelters because by the criteria of AWA and everything, you know, violence has to be perpetrated by like a man. And it doesn't necessarily take place that way. But I found a theory, because it was mind-boggling me. I was like, oh my God, I hate these mother-in-laws. You know, I was getting really mad at them. You know, like my feminist, but the patriarchal bargain. Like some people talk about the fact that, you know, it kind of maintains the system. You put up with it when you're younger, and then when you're older and you have that status, you know, you can use your
it's
power.
Part of having that status and that power. And so violence, the use of violence is equated to status.
It's a very interesting part, because that's where when you were kind of talking about how we have to conceptualize violence, even the term, like I never use intimate partner violence that much because it's not, at least in the context of Pakistan, it could even be uncles. I mean, there's a whole joint family, and it can be a whole variety of people, including women.
Did you find any differentiation within the urban setting between those women who had arrived fairly recently from the rural areas and those who may have lived there for a generation or two?
Well, urban life is very isolating. And so they live in these huts, they don't have social networks, they don't have friends, they don't have family. So in rural settings, they have that. So they have some sort of a social network, a support system, if you will. So even these mother-in-laws who prevent the extreme violence. But in urban settings, that doesn't exist. And so I think in addition to the experiences that they have of violence, they also have the experience of extreme isolation and not having anybody to turn to. So and so those who are new, they have certain ties with their rural family and friends, and they are better off in terms of, I think, in terms of how they feel about themselves and how connected they are to the community, because they still consider their community to be their rural community. They go back often. So it's Eid now, so half of Dhaka is now gone to their rural families. But those who have been in Bangladesh, in Dhaka for a longer period of time, are the ones who are not as rooted. And so when they live in these slum areas, they are often subject to evictions, because they're often in lands that are not meant for that. And so that also creates this idea of isolation, because they don't have one space to call their own, so they keep moving, they're mobile. And so that's another issue with research as well. So if I want to follow up, it's going to be extremely difficult, because they're not often in the same places that I saw them last.
The decision-making on contraceptive use rising with if the woman has microfinancing, were condoms part of that? Like,
Yes.
could you, so that could be quantified too, okay, greater condom use, is that the primary contraceptive method?
That and IUD.
IUD, okay.
But contraceptives is interesting too, particularly in the context of microfinance, which is what I found from this trip to Bangladesh. That a lot of these organizations like BRAC, they have other services, the non-financial services, and that includes contraceptive services. And they funnel those services through microfinance, for example. So if you're accessing microfinance from BRAC, then you will be targeted for services such as contraception. And so when we see that correlation, it's often perhaps because they're the same people, they're targeting them the same way. It may not be because there's something particularly empowering about microfinance that makes them want to do that. So there is that too.
That's interesting though, excuse me, I'm just, the finding about the domestic violence part of it.
Right.
Because that's disempowerment when you can,
Yes.
we sort of conceptualize as empowerment using
Right.
contraception, that's a goal.
Yes.
And I just have to say, I've been chuckling inside though when you were talking all about, the boundary issues when you go to collect data, and, the issues of the paying the subjects and everything, and it's, I had the same experience, and you're there like, oh my God, what would the IRB say about this? Because, there's just, sometimes you have to make snap decisions, like they'll bring people, even this, like I did a lot of interviews in staff settings where there were staff, and they have a different concept of confidentiality. They're like, well, I work with this person, can I sit here? And you know very well that, things are gonna be said depending on who's there in very, very different ways. So, I'm constantly, measuring how much did I get the truth here,
Right. And I think that's what we need to just be okay with, that it's not the truth, but
yeah,
it's,
right, the truth
it's the variation of truth that they want us to hear, and be okay with that.
So you went into this as a researcher, but as a social worker, did you ever find yourself in situations where you were just like, this person really needs help or services or intervention? How did you handle that as a researcher?
Well, I'm not a social worker, I think that
Oh, I'm
helps.
sorry.
but did I feel that yes, they need help, and what? Yeah. So there is that. Yes, they do need help, and then so one thing that again IRB needs to do is I'm supposed to give them information of organizations that can be helpful, such as with IPV or violence, and so I get numbers of like lawyers and agencies that can be helpful. So.
This may be a crazy question, but in a community where violence is ubiquitous on so many levels, how did you even start a conversation that would trigger in their mind that this is, quote unquote, something unique or special or different or violent? And this isn't I just remember from my experiences in the communities in Buffalo, talking to someone about domestic violence is not their language. It isn't.
It's not. Really good question. That's true, because when I started doing this kind of research a couple years ago, one of the questions I'd ask, or I had planned to ask, was, so is there anything going on in your life that that you want to tell me about? They'll tell me about everything but violence. So this question isn't working. And so yes, there is that problem. And so I think what I needed to really figure out was how to ask about this as non-intrusively as possible, but be direct about, I'm asking about violence. And that was really the only way. And again, when the population that I'm interested in, they have so many problems of other sorts. Like poverty, it's huge. They're far more worried about putting food on the table and their children and sending them to school and way more than they're interested in poverty and violence. They don't care as much about that. And in a way, it was difficult to hear because it almost felt like they don't worry about themselves anymore. It's all about their children. It's all about their future, about sending their girls to school, about sending their children to places of work so that they can have upward mobility. But it wasn't about themselves. So there is that.
In the severe cases of violence, when it was okay to leave, did the children stay with the mother-in-law?
Children often just go with mothers.
Okay, so they were, a woman who was a victim of severe violence would be able to take her children and leave without suffering a lot of social repercussions?
So ones that I spoke to whose husbands were not parts of their lives anymore, their children lived with them, yes. But often the husband has left. So it was, I can't recall a case where the woman left and with children. It was mostly that the husband left. And so that's interesting too, I think, that women, they don't.
Based on what you were saying before, I mean, even if there's extreme violence and the wife is able to leave with the kids, their prospects are pretty slim because they're not able to get assistance. They're not. I mean, so
So that's why they don't.
I mean, it would have to be literally life-threatening,
Right.
and even then, what are they gonna do?
They don't have
right?
anywhere to go.
Yeah.
And and that's why they won't leave. It's not because it's acceptable to have that kind of violence in your life, but it's because they often don't have it.
I'm not sure, like, if this is part of your study, but the idea of, like, do I guess the in-laws or even parents give punitive measures to their kids? Do they, like, are violent with their children as well, or not so much? Or, yeah, and then with mother-in-laws, are they, like, able to hit, like, their, like, grandson versus a granddaughter? Would it be different, or?
I don't study that, but I would
Okay.
assume that they do hit their children and their grandchildren. And there is some degree of preference of boys versus girls, and so perhaps, but not as much as in say India, where female feticide is really high. But there is perhaps some. Yeah, again, I can't not my
Yeah, I
research,
know, that's
but
why I was
still.
like, it's probably not your
Yeah.
research, but if
It'd be
there's
hard to-
anything that you
But
might
I can make
pick
sense
up
of
on.
it and say that maybe that's true, but I don't really have the
Thank you.
I don't know about it is corporal punishment, because in Pakistan, it's, it's
Yeah.
accepted, even teachers could, my
Yeah.
husband is from Pakistan, he said teachers could hit them, they thought that was good.
Yeah.
So I don't know, I mean, I know
Yeah.
there's differences, but,
No,
so.
teachers hit.
Well, in some states it's legal to do
Right,
that.
right,
Or-
yeah, right, but now, I mean, certain groups in Pakistan, some human rights, children's rights groups are trying to promote more of an awareness of corporal I mean, that's a long haul, but, it's, I don't know.
So, in the room here, we have people who are learning about important things, and so I'm not intending this to be a personal question, but one of the things we talk to students about is self-care, we talk about vicarious trauma, and I just wonder, I mean, these are really impactful things that you're seeing, and really challenging, and I think that for many of us, even just listening to some of this and then imagining that these are people's lives, I don't know if there's any thoughts that you can share, or just as far as, again, how to walk that fine line as a researcher, and to be able to still go back again and do it again.
Well, one thing I do is I don't look at the data right away. So once I've collected the data, I've gone through that process, I don't look at it until I'm kind of done with it and I've made sense of it. So that distance I think is it. And so once I then, when I sit with the data, then I look at it as data and not as people. That's how I do it. I don't know if there's a right way or a wrong way, but for me to look at it as data is important so that I'm not invested in somebody's life. So yeah.
Kind of give yourself some space to be able to then process.
To forget what they look like, to forget that this
Sure.
is what their house looked like, and so on. So I don't like thinking about them in that space. I think that's important for my objectivity as well. So that distance, so that it's also not emotional rating, that I'm actually being able to present what it is that I'm trying to present. So again, I'm not speaking for them, and I'm speaking about them. But to be able to do that in a way that's honest, I think is critical. Thanks. And I run.
In one of your earlier slides, intra-party violence was something that you showed us. Is this something that will get news media coverage? And two, the intra-violence versus the inter-party violence just seems, I would have expected more inter-party violence.
Well, there are hierarchies within parties as well,
Okay.
and there's student groups. So I think that's what makes it interesting. So there's
okay.
student politics is a big thing. So university campuses have student wings of all political parties, and they become extremely violent. And there's student leaders, and student leaders often take on roles of like normal leaders, and that creates problems. And then because they operate as an apparatus of the system and not the political party, there are intra-party infractions.
Okay. And headlines, does this make headlines?
It does, yeah.
Okay.
Some of it does. Some of it doesn't. Depends on who's ruling. So if it's a ruling party, then you don't hear as much. When it's not, you do.
This is just more of a comment. I mean, I always love hearing you talk because it makes me think, in comparison with Pakistan. But in Pakistan, the activists that I've talked to all really look to Bangladesh. Like they feel the women's movement has it much better there. I mean, and that there's been much more, emphasis on trying to do women's development. And sometimes you shatter that, and sometimes you build that when I talk to you. But that's sort of that's.
It's all relative. I think that's what it means. I think there, sure, a lot of inroads have been made in making women's issue an issue, and it sees a lot of press. It has political impact, but so much more is left to be done. So I think that's what we need to focus on as well. Yes.
Hi, I was just wondering, you talked a lot about the narrative of violence being part of everyday life. I was just wondering, what do you think would be the factors to maybe change this narrative? I know you talked about sex being taboo and that being part of that, but is there a way to, maybe through religion, maybe through cultural ways to talk about changing the narrative?
Well, that's a big question.
Yeah, I know. I don't want to you to solve the problem right now. It's so easy. It's snap your
Well,
fingers.
someone was telling me about how an NGO was working with religious leaders to break the idea of violence. But in a country where violence is again so pervasive, it's not just in violence at home. It's not just violence on the street. It's violent language as well. So I think perhaps language is the first space to start, because I think we need to start somewhere, and two, because that's perhaps the easiest to do, and awareness of how violence actually has an impact on future generations as well. I think one thing that I will take away from interviews in Bangladesh is that they are future oriented. They want their children to do better. So maybe to impress upon them the importance of that future and how their current behaviors in terms of violence has an impact on them. Maybe that.
And also through education and things like that. that's what they're doing in India right now. Trying to start young, you know, start the children talking about how they view women, how they would treat women in relationships and things like that.
Women and other minority groups.
Yeah,
as well.
yeah.
I think that in Bangladesh that remains an issue. So that and modeling those behaviors. You know, I think, you know, when you have teachers who tell them, oh, you shouldn't talk about like this, you know, about women, and then, you know, you go and hit somebody, you know, that there's a disconnect there. And so I think that needs to happen too.
I think it's a great question, and we could ask that for ourselves, right, in this
Yes.
country.
Yeah.
You know, because, I mean, I did love your whole discussion about how violence is across institutions. And I think in many ways it's institutionalized here, in all of our institutions, you know, affecting different groups disproportionately. So it's almost like we would have to get rid of patriarchal global capitalism. And it also makes, you know, that made me think, you know, and I haven't thought about this in a while. I so appreciated how you juxtaposed family and workplace, you know, because also I think about workplaces here, you know, and how, and so it's a huge task for us to eliminate violence, because our violence it just characterizes our institutions. It's huge.
On that happy note. Thank you, Global Institute, for having me. This was wonderful. Thank you, Hillary.
Thank you. And if there's anyone who hasn't signed in, please do so. I've got the form here, and please fill out the feedback forms for us.
Was this filled out?
I need one.
Here's a step.
Sorry, I ended on a downer.